Hi, welcome to Reality Plus Us. I'm Avi Barzev.
And I'm Helen Papagiannis, and in today's episode, we're going to be speaking with CNET Editor at Large, Scott Stein. Welcome, Scott.
Hey, thanks. Great to be on here. Good to meet. Good to see both of you. I've talked to you for a while, but it's great to connect.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you. And, you've been writing about AR, VR, wearable tech, gaming, immersive tech for many years at CNET. And one of the things that I really appreciate about your perspective is you have a background in theater. And so some of our listeners may not know that. So how do those two worlds collide for you? How do they come together, theater and technology?
Thanks. Yeah, theater was the beginning, or creative writing, and way back when I was doing MFA in theater, this is 20 plus years ago, I was actually writing about tech. So my plays, college, my thesis play was about chat rooms, and it was called Utopia Parkway. It was about people finding spaces in other worlds. It was 95, 96, and kind of the psychology of connection. And then I wrote a play about MMORPGs in grad school called Empirica, and then I was so it all seems really connected now in retrospect. But like I was thinking about the future of this during that first .com, I was doing theater stuff. Then I started falling into tech and tech writing and magazines, and it's funny because all this time now I've still thought of myself as a lapsed creative. So as it came back around to covering VR and wearables, I kind of found these like narratives of that felt theatrical and magical, especially wearing things. There's everything is sort of theater in itself. Everything's trying to be. There's some performance going on in it, and now it feels like a very fertile time for that with all the headsets that are popping up. So it's been interesting.
Absolutely. And you know what? You're a voracious reader. You're always sharing the books that you're reading on socials. And, two books come to mind that I wonder if have kind of come across your desk or even as you were studying. Brenda Laurel's Computers as Theater, and Janet Murray, Hamlet on the Holodeck. I see you nodding. So yes.
Yes. So Hamlet on the Holodeck I read a while ago, and then I reread probably, I don't remember how many years ago, and exactly that popped up. And Computers as Theater I read, I think, in 2019.
Yeah.
Right when I was flying out to go see HoloLens 2. That kind of like
Oh, wow.
bonded in my head at that time. And I remember talking to Microsoft about it. I don't know if they had heard about the book, or maybe the person I spoke to hadn't. So yeah, you're right. Like those are very much those are fantastic books, and I think it's interesting because the perspective at large. Right now, we think about headsets literally putting us into that space, but I love the Computers as Theater approach, where it's like technology we don't even think about as taking us to a holodeck like environment can still have an element of theater to it. And so I think that's interesting now for any new tech. And they all feel like they're kind of converging now in interesting ways.
Yeah, you bet. I mean, Avi, you worked at Disney. You've got some examples of this,
Yeah,
right?
totally. I was going to say that the some of the people that were best adapted to doing VR work in 1992 were people from the theater. We had a creative director on Aladdin's Magic Carpet Ride, and he had been a set builder in the theater professionally. And it was exactly the same task, just digitally instead of with paint. So you'd have to make these giant flats, right? You take paint on canvas over a wood frame. It's just this giant picture, but it's got to look dimensional. It's got to have lighting. It's got to have texture. And that's exactly what we did in computer graphics with giant polygons. Before we could do all the modern techniques that make things look amazing today, it was all just giant polygons painted by hand and looking really good. So that translated really well. And then the other part, I think that was always true for animators. All the best animators that I know are also actors because they record themselves doing the story, saying the lines, feeling the feelings, and then they animate what they did as humans. Like they use themselves as a kind of model for it. And you can see that really clearly in some of the special features on movies where the movie's animated and they show you how it was made. You can just see the animators making the motions exactly as the character later does. So it's pretty amazing how those things have translated. I could say, though, you mentioned the HoloLens. I can't think of anybody who had a theater background, at least on the early team for the HoloLens, so that didn't play in as much. It was more of a games background. Almost everybody working on it was in Xbox to begin with, and so there was much more of a games background. But I think In other areas, I'm trying to think about Apple. There was definitely people there who came from theater background as well.
Yeah.
And there are lots of really important lessons to learn from the theater in terms of how do you engage people, how do you keep their attention, how do you get them to look where they're supposed to be looking and not at the things going on in the background. So that's all super relevant to design. And I'll just say one last thing was personally on my own journey, I got into VR because I wanted to make movies. Like I wanted to be the storyteller, and the tools were so bad that I've spent 30 years working on trying to make the hardware and software usable so that I could finally go back and me and a few other people can go and make a movie, because I just never wanted to have to go raise $100 million to go make a Hollywood level movie with all the people that requires. We should be able to make a movie with just the three of us. We should be able to sit here and have the tools to make it. And we're almost there. We're almost getting to the point where we can do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful to hear that parallel. Yeah, and I think about what's been popping up in my head lately a lot is improv. And so for the past couple of years, this has sort of been floating in my head. My background, I'd done improv in the past, way back in college, and popped in and out. But I've been interested in that, especially now in this world of generative AI, and I started getting back into writing and thinking about writing and where AI pops in, and some of these apps and the way that they work. There was this one on Vive. There was a kind of an improvisational animated, I forget the name of it now, but where you kind of explore these things with other people. And there's a interactive acting teacher, Jeff Worth, who had brought me into some improv sessions a couple of years ago in Altspace VR, which were the best things I've done yet. And he was exploring kind of like what you were saying, Avi, about almost animating in a commedia type way, presenting your persona because you have limited elements. And so the way that your eyes convey, your body conveys, the way you exaggerate versus how you communicate, I just feel like this is like ahead of its time on if we're really going to be using avatars, personas, other things, other spaces, enhancing ourselves different ways. Then I think the idea of like what we are versus what we perform as there's an interesting question. There's all sorts of questions going on with that.
I think everybody I've ever met has an inherent ability to play a persona. If you tell them they may not be the world's best actor, they may not be great at improv, but they can stand up there and pretend to be somebody else that they're not. And at least some of us find that fun. Not everybody finds it fun, but a lot of people do. And it's a super important way to, that's, I think one of the ways that VR may be best used is for exploring that creative side, exploring other personas other than our real, our daily selves. And that was the basis of Second Life as well. Like, we're not going to try to replace the real world in Second Life. We're going to give you an alternate ego so you can be a different part of yourself, not the part that you bring to work and family, but something else. And it was popular with a reasonably large number of people, not everybody, but a reasonably large number, 8 million or so, I think, at the peak. So there's something there. I will give you one more short story though that led up to the HoloLens, and it wasn't the HoloLens itself, but before the HoloLens, I was in the startup business group at Microsoft, and we got our hands on some early Kinects. I can only get one because it was so scarce before it launched. It was very hard to get any. That's how I actually met the people from the Xbox division, was getting that Kinect camera. But what we used it for was to try to create avatars of multiple people sitting on a stage and talking. And so that we shipped it. It wasn't great. It was called Avatar Connect or Connect Avatar, but it used the body tracking to be able to have your avatar have a virtual conversation like we're doing here, but the three of us would be avatars sitting on a stage. I think the problem with it, though, was that the tracking wasn't good enough yet back then. Also, take any random three people and put them on a stage, and they're not necessarily going to have a lot to talk about. So it turned into sort of the world's most boring talk show format because nobody could move around, you couldn't play games, you just sort of sat there being able to talk to people. And when the tracking went wrong, it was like your arm is over your head and you're still trying to talk. So it was actually more useful for comedy, at least unintentional comedy, than anything else. But anyway, that project got me connected with the folks in Xbox. That's how the whole thing for me started, was doing that first, and then we got on to do the AR stuff later.
Well, I think about the Connect, and I think about something, Scott, you said in an interview with Kent Bai on Voices of VR, and how you talked about when there's a new technology, how at the beginning it's really experimental and there are these kind of wonderful, weird, wacky, kind of artistic explorations. And we saw that a lot with the Kinect. And, to even tie it back to Janet Murray's book, Hamlet on the Holodeck, there was an article in the New Yorker back in 2017, Matt, I think, Margini, and he said Murray became devoted to creating, okay, you got to tell me this word. You probably came across it in the book. Incunabula. Does this sound familiar to you, Scott? Incunabula.
Yes, and I forget what it referred to, but yes.
Yeah. Yes. So
now I want to look it up.
Yeah, I've got it here. So it's a term meaning swaddling clothes, which is used by book historians to describe awkward experiments produced just after the invention of the printing press. So in this article, Matt says, so digital incunabula are the main subject of Hamlet on the Holodeck. So when Murray analyzes a video game or a piece of hypertext fiction or a primitive AI character, she seldom praises it as a complete or refined narrative experience. What she celebrates is its potential. And so I think about the Kinect and how we just saw artists having these wonderful explorations early on with the possibility of that tech. And it made me think about that interview with Kent that you had, Scott, and how you did talk about how there's something that you really admired and appreciated at the beginning of a new technology when there were all these wonderful experiments, and that it's something that you hope is never lost as these technologies become, I think you called them as they become more corporate. Talk to us a little about that. And I'm wondering, maybe there's some examples that you want to share of some of these weird, wonderful things that you've come across.
Yeah, so I love incunabula. In fact, I was looking up and seeing, did I write that down as a note to remind myself? And there was nothing there, but that's exactly it. Yeah, for me, that's actually what I fell in love with when I was working in theater. And then when I moved out of theater, I kind of felt like I was feeling frustrated. And then I remind myself that was sort of a bit of that too, because I was thinking, this is a space that's it's blank. It should have no location. I mean, I really love the team at No Proscenium, who's dedicated to immersive theater. They kind of remind me, for me, it was the idea of no assumptions, even in terms of a stage or anything else. But even now, immersive theater is becoming kind of a genreified a little bit, and so I wanted to just explore and make this a wild exploratory space. And when I was in grad school, nothing wrong with grad school, but it was a place where it looked like people were trying to get into regional theaters and discover, very, very commerce-based paths for what they were doing. And like you said, I wanted the incunabula. I wanted to explore. I wanted to be part of these weird teams. Things like Oulipo, which I collected books on, and I still haven't really read, but exploratory literature, these kind of modernist movements and things. These are things that I really am in love with the idea of, and I don't want them to even get baked in my own head. So I think that's something that I fall in love with new tech, and then it's true, at some point it passes on to becoming, there's this moment where you go I don't really need you to tell me about it because I have one. I just need to know if I need to get the next one. And I felt like that definitely happened with wearables, with smartwatches, and it happened with phones. VR is interesting because doing workouts in Supernatural recently, it was, another suburban friend, a mom in town, who had already bought a Quest 2 for herself, and she reminded me of Supernatural because I had some blood pressure problems. And I thought, I know about Supernatural, I've covered this, but it was interesting because I feel VR can be getting close to that too, where people go, I know what it is, you don't need to take me on the journey. There's something a little bit sad about that, but also necessary, because everyone has to experience it. But I do love the initial journey into the unknown. So I guess for me, all of the Oculus demos from early days were that. All of the Oculus Studios projects where they bring in artists, and a lot of the Tribeca experiences, the things that were remote Sundance things I would try, artists that were really working on a shoestring. I mean, I remember Jack, the one that was by Baobab, which was it was a real actors with VR headsets on and trackers. And I put it on and I was in the scene, but I was interacting, but I was really holding a broom, and it was the real world overlapping. Moments like that, which were often demos and art experiences, were the things that I always found pretty astounding. I mean, even recently, trying out Meta's glasses with the kind of early Gen AI thing, was just interesting to see it try to understand the environment and see the limits. And you go, well, where is it working? Where is it not? If it becomes more utility based, which it wants to be at some point, I would imagine all tech, there's also like a little bit of the end of that kind of theater experimentation magic, because you're like, okay, I need this to do something. I need this, I need to get somewhere fast. Stop doing the. I don't need I don't need a magical theater performance anymore. And so I'm kind of always looking for those moments. And you mentioned specifics. I'm trying to think of even more, but really a lot of times it's the initial demos. It's the initial moments where Oculus Crescent Bay, where they kind of set you in a room with a bunch of 3D experiences. And you're finding, what am I doing reacting to this space, crawling underneath furniture, doing this. It's like the first time reaction to that. Even things like The Void, which is location-based entertainment. So who's the other one where Lucas Rosado, who does, where thoughts go, and I haven't tried Pillow yet, but I feel like he's like Incunabula incarnate.
Yes.
But like, I do very much love all of that. I just spoke for a lot. Sorry, but
no, it's so good to hear
good.
your perspective. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the stuff you're talking about will also still exist beyond utility. For when we have outdoor all-day wearable AR glasses someday, we will have them. And they're going to be able to paint the world, but that's actually not the only thing they can paint. They can also overlay things on other people. So people are going to be able to choose their own digital fashions, or costumes in this case. And it'll be a fairly collaborative thing, because my glasses will have to see the outfit you chose and present you in the way that you chose it. Because I think it gets really bad if you leave it up to the wearer to describe how everybody should look. We don't really want that world. But the world in which everybody can express themselves in this extra digital layer becomes really interesting, because then you could be, imagine yourself living in a Shakespearean play, but going to work and doing all the normal things you're doing. But you see randomly other people who are also dressed up in the era, and you know that they're part of the same program. And so you could have this sort of secret play going on in the real world with other people. I'm positive that'll exist, right? That just seems like a natural thing for people to want to do. And it's much easier than things people have already talked about, like, let's go make laser tag. Like, no, don't make laser tag, because you're going to get somebody killed. They're going to be walking around pretending to shoot people, and the cop's not going to understand what you see, because they don't see it. And so you can really get someone in trouble. But role playing is fine. People will just think you're crazy if they can't see what you're saying. That's all. But they already think I'm crazy anyway. So what do I have to lose, right? But it's going to be pretty common for us to have these shared overlays on the world that are just as creative as they are, I think, utilitarian.
Yeah, and that's what reminds me of the thing when I see immersive theater. I've been also been thinking for the past few years that you have to go to a place to have that experience, and usually in big cities and living in the suburbs, I think, well, why isn't this stuff happening here? And that the kind of dream of AR is like, you can make this stuff happen anywhere. You think about kids playing, or what Niantic was exploring, beginning to explore with Lightship, and that I was always curious to see what would have happened with the Punch Drunk project, but I think about like micro immersion, like that Meow Wolf and those types of like artsy immersive experiences, but in like a very small ad hoc improv type way. And so, like you said, like I hope there are ways that kind of spontaneous, like mobile tech does this. You can instantly pop up, have little local groups, etc. But like local pickup, like I want like pickup improv-y, spontaneous multiversal stuff. That happens like arts or theater. And then why does it need to have a stage or a space? And here even now it's like it's very hard to get that going. And even in immersive theater, people talk about the expenses of running something. And then I think, like, why can't it be the equivalent of like any space can be this, and you do like a kind of a shoestring. I agree. Like there's something, that dream for me is like a very interesting one that I hope gets curated.
I mean, we've seen it in VR, not so much in AR yet. I remember this headline that you wrote back in 2016, and I remember it, and I can't believe it was 2016. And you said the best VR I experienced all year had no tech at all. And you're probably laughing. You know what I'm talking about. And I'm sure things have changed for you. I mean, I'll ask you, have they, and has there been something? There's one particular experience that kind of comes to mind, but I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. Then she fell.
Exactly.
Third
Yeah.
Rail. That's why I fell in love with that group and started seeing all their stuff. And that was the year that all the headsets came out. And that immersive. At the same time, I was getting much deeper into immersive theater, and it reminded me sensorily and kind of viscerally all these things you kind of want that. That are not quite there yet. And then there was another one I wrote as a follow-up, which was in 2019, which made me think about AR, which was their impossible to get into. Like it was basically it was a McAllen sponsored experience called
Yes. I remember messaging you about that. Yeah.
yes, and they had
Yeah.
reached out about it. It was impossible. It was all free
Yeah.
tickets, but it was like it went in a second. But it was this two-person experience that I had written about, and it moved from space to space. It kind of felt like everything everywhere all at once or something, in the real world, like this magical thing. And it was like the way that, like, when you mentioned about transforming reality, they did it at a crazy scale that they even said
Yes.
would have been ridiculously prohibitively expensive to even if you had bought a ticket. But I think that a lot of the arts are modeling these dreamscapes of what hopefully the tech can begin to model. I think most recently for me that was definitely Meow Wolf, and
Yes.
I was very late to Meow Wolf, but then I saw I went super into them last year. I saw 3 of their 4 spaces, and then they did a VR golf course at the end of the year. It turned out. So I think it's interesting to me because as I wrote about when you mentioned most recently when I wrote about them,
Yeah.
I think it hit me on a different way that was more metaverse. Like the metaverse link hit me, which again everyone's tired of the term metaverse, but for me it was like a metaphor for groups converging and collaborating. And I saw that there was something so interesting in how they they have this collective that, and I don't really know the deep details, but I've tried to follow that they have a concept for the space. They have individual artists that get their own freedom. And then they work in and do this like magic kind of fairy dust around it. But it's like many different people with freedom and also constraints, but they get to work within the rules. And it made me think of like Horizon Worlds, or it made me think of like all the dreams of these spaces that people go, oh, we're going to have a space, and then you can make your space, and then you'll discover that world. And it usually kind of ends up like a big mess. But then what Meow Wolf was having as this superstructure, like, made me think of like, well, if arts groups start coming in and building more organized structures in these open spaces. Right now it's like tech companies going, build it and they will come, alt space, people will think of it, but you need something that's the equivalent of like a black box theater that you go, yeah, arts groups will come in. Like you still need like a great arts group. You still need a great theater company, great directors to come in and envision what you can do with the empty space. And so I think that, and that was another thing I read last year, was Peter Brook's The Empty Space, which I had not read I had it in grad school, never read it, but like, it made me think again about like, he talks about like what's deadly theater, what's exciting theater, and how it always has to be rethought. Made me think about how tech and art need to be like, just because we know what VR is now doesn't mean we know what it is. And I keep reminding myself to keep reopening the thought process and not let it calcify. But that's what I think about now, is like we're in this space for so long, but now we're entering it again, and like the arts elements, not just we're making a thing, but we're making a superstructure.
Yeah, that makes me so happy to hear as an artist. So my background is originally in fine arts, art history. So I came to AR from the humanities, from the design world, from working at Bruce Mau Design. And at that time, it was so heavily rooted in computer science and, robots, AR 2005, right? And so hearing you talk about the arts, that has a very special place in my heart. So I'm happy to hear that. The other production that comes to mind, The Under Presents, Tender Claws. You had a chance to experience that too. And that was something that was almost kind of like improv, cabaret, theater, like all of these weird, wonderful things coming together. And I think that surprised a lot of us, right? Because of the live actors and the, you know, the audience participation. And you've talked about this in the past of being in immersive theater, the audience is part of it. They're responding, they're interacting. And in VR, typically you're just kind of observing, right? And so there was something special that I think they were able to pull off. It'd be good to hear your thoughts on that, on Tender Claws and what they were able to do.
Yeah. So Tender Claws is great. I wanted even so much more with the Under Presents, and it's like I know it's like getting started. I hope there's more to come with that. I know Tender Claws is working on the Stranger Things experience, doing a little more like bigger, recognizable quantities. But the Under Presents was still one of my favorite Quest experiences, and because it was so elusive. You know, it was something that, and I think that's the quality that you go, you know, a lot of these games you can browse, a lot of these apps you browse the store and you kind of get the summary and you go, okay, it's like this, I know what it is. And this thing, you go, what is this? Yes. And I love that, the what is this feeling. And you're wandering through and you have kind of almost like a Sleep No More, in that you have kind of a bit of a mask theme going on. And then, but you're wandering around this deserty space, and then the people who interact with you you can't speak. They can speak sometimes. And there's this kind of language of communication that, you know, you're trying to communicate. There's these magical gestures you incant that do things. You're trying to figure out what does what. I remember there were things, I made this thing appear. I don't know why. And then there was this cabaret that there were performances. Some of them were recorded, but some of them were live. And I remember sitting there going, is that live? Is that not live? Is that person? And they were having a lot of live performers early on, moving through the space and interacting. And then they moved into doing an actual theater piece, which was The Tempest, adaptation of The Tempest, that you go and move through a group of people, more traditionally performed, but where we all gathered around and did things. And it gave me that feeling that, again, I've had some theater experiences with Tribeca that have been in that type of a realm. I'm trying to remember the one that was built in VR chat, where I was like a kid in a family, and the parents were taking care of me, and it was like just like a magical dream. But the Under Presents, that was that one theater piece, and it was during the pandemic.
Yes.
I spoke to some of the actors and the performers and how they were doing things. I believe Dasha Kittredge being one of them, and so there were some third rail overlaps, I believe, if I'm remembering this right. So that I thought that was really the beginning of something, and then it felt to be continued when I did the Improv with Jeff Worth. You know, sadly we never got to do the final part, which was going to be performing, with doing a small performance. And there were some things that got in the way in the end and interrupted what was unfortunately a wonderful process for us. But I was really curious about that, you know, like, and I think that we don't have enough of those yet, right? Like, it's just getting started, but I keep looking around and being like, where are the performance spaces? And there's like comedy clubs, but, you know, to me, that's like, I'm not interested in improv for comedy. I'm interested in dramatic improv, about the idea of the kind of weird psychological structure of it, the communication. And so I hope that the performance things aren't just like, oh, you're going to play a party game, but it's like something that really, you don't know the rules yet. But that's tough because it's trust. Then there's also that thing too of like, how do you deal with bad actors and trust? And there was a piece I wrote too about during the pandemic that was about getting us into our comfort zones, which is where I also mentioned the improv class, and that VR was still trying to figure out your comfort zone. And I think that that's a question that I want to fold in there, which is that, you know, I'm a guy, I'm white, you know, I say this because comfort in VR, comfort in performance in spaces, I've heard this brought up before, comfort in immersive, there's elements that you feel with something on your head that you might feel vulnerable to, and you have other people, and there's questions of behavior. So anyway, this brings up all these interesting questions of social media is so toxic. What happens here? How can you build communities? I'm going way off into all these realms, but like I think about this because these are all the questions that I think are going to happen as it gets more mass market, But I hope the arts things on the small scale need to be done as like a lab to explore and build community. That I think it's not just art, but it's, it's that too.
There's two important things.
Go ahead, Avi.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
There's two things I pulled out of that I think are worth maybe drilling in on. One is the safety aspect, because I would definitely agree with the statement that probably the biggest thing that's held back the VR side of things in general has been safety, has been lots of people not wanting to wear something in an environment that they may not feel safe in, but also not feeling safe in the virtual environment. And then the other thing is that you mentioned bad actors, and you can take bad actors in two ways. One is people who are malevolent. The other is people who are poor actors, right? They're not very good at acting. And the second one we can help, because you can imagine today we're within squinting distance of being able to take generative AI, and because we can do language translation on the fly now, we could also potentially do acting translation. And so I could be saying, here I am, and my character is saying it in a better way. It's saying, it's now I'm all of a sudden speaking in iambic pentameter, and all the things that I would have wanted to be able to do with lots of practice, I could now do with some help from the computer. So I think we're going to be, I think we'll be in good shape to be able to do a lot of the things that we want to do. We have been held back though by not enough people have training in improv or acting to be able to just do it spontaneously, that they need some practice, or else they're going to be like, just not ready to do it. And they need to feel safe, because if you're in any kind of environment and you want to be creative, it's incredibly hard when there's going to be someone who's going to go hurt you for what you say, or tell you you're doing it wrong or whatever. We're all hypersensitive to that. But even inside these big companies, plenty of examples of being in brainstorming sessions where we're trying to come up with features and product ideas. And there's plenty of people who are well trained at doing that, and they know it's the same rule as improv. You never say no. In a brainstorming session, you never say that's a bad idea. That's at the end of the process where you need to filter out the bad ideas. But in the brainstorming part, everything is yes and, just like in improv. You accept what somebody says and you try to add to it. You try to make it even better and run with it and see where it goes, because it's that collaboration with other people is what gets us to a new place. That's something that none of us could have done by ourselves. But there's always one person you have to take aside and train them on that, because they're like, you know what, you're technically right, that was a bad idea, but you shouldn't have said it because you shut the person down, and now they're not giving us their great ideas anymore. Helen, sorry, I hogged the stage for a while, so go ahead. What were you
Oh, no, not at all. Some of the things that you were talking about, Scott, when you're like, wait, what is this? It reminded me actually word for word from our last episode with Julian Bleeker, who wrote the manual the Manual of Design Fiction. And we were talking about it's so good. It's so good.
I've bought all their stuff recently. That's so funny. That's interesting coincidence. Yeah.
You'll love Julian. The episode is great. He's just he's amazing. And he was talking about Meow Wolf. So I think you two need to do a podcast. You two need to hang out. So he was talking about Meow Wolf in the last episode, and how there's just slightly something off, and you're like, wait, what is this? And we talked a lot about that, about these moments where is something real, is something fiction, and it was an episode on artifacts from the future. So anyway, so that came to mind, and you'll really enjoy the book. It's wonderful. It's very inspiring. Something else that go ahead.
I was just saying, it's sitting by my bedside table, like in a treasured little spot where I just keep looking at it. I have the design cards too. I went full deep in the territory with them, but. Yeah, I'm excited. It's
Which
really
cover
cool.
do you have? Do you have
that's
this cover?
That's the cover I have. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
One.
Yeah. It's great. The Manual of Design Fiction. So something else that we should talk about, the wonderful elephant in the room, something that you've been able to experience 3 times, in fact. I don't know if any other journalist has.
I've never gotten to try the final thing yet. I'm waiting till mine shows up. But you've now got to try it 3 times. So for people who haven't seen you already talk about this, I know you've talked about this in your articles and other places, but just give us a summary of your thoughts on it. I'm really interested to hear what works and maybe what doesn't work, or what you're still waiting to see.
Yeah, so Vision Pro, to me, when I first did the demo, and when I was waiting to hear, I obviously had a million thoughts about what it would be, and it kind of reminded me of with the Apple Watch. You follow a field for a long time, and you go, okay, what are they going to do with this after a lot of experimentation has been out there? And the first thing that hit me was really about technical achievement. You know, I thought that was what I felt coming out of it. And everyone had different feelings. But, you know, for me, it was like I had seen elements of this certainly in other headsets. And I think that the quality of pass-through and the resolution of the display, the closest thing was the Vario XR3. You know, like their quality of their displays, and that feeling of seeing a Retina display type VR that feels real, and oh wow, something feels like it's in the room. I'm starting to lose track of that pass-through mix. I mean, they introduced that for me a couple of years ago. So but then I was really impressed that Apple's headset, the pass-through quality is really, really good. And the display is phenomenal. Like, to me, I think the thing that hit me, which I said when I wrote it up, was something very seemingly minor, but like watching movies on it. Because that was the thing for me, like, I don't do a lot of stuff in VR, but video watching, for monitors, VR is actually, high-res VR is actually pretty good now. Movies tend to have a little more loss with color quality or other things. But at least with the clips I saw, watching Avatar and things like that, this felt like, oh wow, I'd want to watch a movie in this. This feels like kind of the personal cinema that, you know, with Oculus headsets going way back, you go, the feel is there viscerally, but the display quality is not quite there. And this excited me because I was like, I think the display quality is there, and I have to see more of that. So that hit me. And then the gesture interface, again, seeing a lot of stuff like this Oculus hand tracking, this was like kind of a lot of people talked about how lazily easy it is. You know, like everyone seemed to have their hand kind of lying down casually and doing just the scrolling, thing with eye tracking. And that was a lot less annoying than any of the sort of like physical reaching out. And a lot of the stuff in Meta's hand tracking to this point has been much more intensely purposeful and sometimes a little hard to lock on. Sometimes, you know, to get to exit the menu, sometimes you have to try it a bunch of times. So those things together were really impressive. And like eye tracking in VR headsets I've seen before, but I haven't seen it worked with hand tracking. And MetaQuest Pro didn't evolve that. The eye tracking was much more turn on, turn off, not always on in the interface, which Apple seems to be doing, but you know, with the extended battery. So those are the things that really struck me. They really were on technical notes, but like, and I thought it was really cool. But then I go, wait, I've just been sitting down and browsing through menus. Like, this is just a bunch of 2D apps. Like, the thing at the very end when I first saw it, which was like the dinosaur coming out, I was like, oh, okay, here we go. Here's some of the stuff that I'm expecting, kind of Oculus-y type stuff. And that was really cool, getting close to it, looking at the detail. But I was a little surprised that there was nothing like, you know, meshing the room. Or, you know, here's a robot behind the chair. Or, you know, like Magic Leap, some of the demos I did when I went to their headquarters. You know, it's like, you know, you're going to cover this room in an aquarium and textures. So I was like, how come that's not happening? Why am I not walking around? Is it caution, or is it that the version 1 is going to limit your movement? And the other question I have is, how deep is the hand tracking? Like right now, it's been a lot of mouse control point things, but in a 3D space, a spatial environment, you know, how am I grabbing things? How am I doing that? And some of the developers have been looking at stuff like that with you know, already with some of the stuff in the SDK, but like, how much can you do? This has no controllers, you know, and I haven't connected it with a Mac. I can get a chance to see it with a Mac, extending the display. The second 2 demos I did were very much focused on the spatial photos, the 3D stereoscopic, which people have been saying, like, what is that? That's not really spatial, that's 3D. And it's certainly Apple's language for that. But I do feel like it's a foot in the door. Like, I feel like what's happening clearly is like they keep evolving the camera tech. And so this first version is 3D stereoscopic cameras. Like, that's obviously existed before. And I looked at VR 180 and things like going way back with like Google and all that sort of stuff. So Apple, and they played back first pre-recorded stuff that they had, then I got to shoot one, and then they let me record some 3D videos of my own on the iPhone and then airdrop it over to see it for my third demo. And then on the way, kind of looking at a few things like pinching to zoom, looking at photos and panoramas, but very narrow in it, which makes me interested in what about everything else. But I think the video quality, as I said, looked really good. But then as I did it the second time, I realized that a lot of that is also the quality of the display. This micro OLED display and how good it is. The video quality is really nice because it's shot on their cameras. It looks good. It's the amount to which it's contained in this fuzzy border, and you can't seemingly zoom it out further. Unlike the videos where other videos you can zoom out to like a tremendous canvas. I thought, well, I want to get closer. And then also the 30 frames per second, I felt was a little limiting because VR has such a high refresh rate, or Vision Pro has such a high refresh rate that you notice the 30 frames per second much more to me than on the phone. It's interesting because I play back those video clips on the phone and I go, they look fine. They look great. But in the headset, I think I'm expecting a reality that moves at a faster frame rate. So I think that obviously they could get there. They could keep bumping up the frame rate, maybe have volumetric someday down the road. Other apps are already exploring things like this, or people have been contacting me being like, look at the stuff we're doing out there with like, was it Gaussian splatting and whatever. It's like, I go, okay, fine. Like that's down the road. You cannot lean into it. But I think that the questions for me are, how does that outer display feel? How does that avatar relationship with personas work? How deeply collaborative is the 3D? Is Apple kind of putting a headset out, and now feels like they're putting a headset out before the framework for the rest of the apps and everything else? And maybe WWDC this year is like, people are expecting is almost like the big coming out party for the rest of what it can do. I don't know. So I think I have all these questions, like how's that battery pack feel when you move around? It seems like they're going computer first, everything else second, and obviously even fitness. I've been using Supernatural now pretty regularly, and I think it's great. And I thought Apple would be an obvious candidate for making fitness. I thought that was the first thing they were going to do for it. And now I'm thinking it's something they'll do once they finesse everything even more, and figure out how to make this work better. But it's obviously going to be in the wheelhouse. So I kind of feel like I'm like ready for it to go to like step 8, and I go, okay, we're at step 1. Those are my big thoughts right now using it, is that it's like, yeah, like, but I think from a display and interface side for hand tracking and things like that, it's starting at such a high level that, and then app integration, like, is it going to be easier for people to go, I can just hook in this stuff and use it? I imagine that's what Google and Samsung are going to be looking at too, but I don't know. Apple is very consistent year over year, like deliberately incremental, that I wonder, I hope that Samsung and Google will be the same way, but I think that's going to be could be the advantage here. But we don't even know what this headset will be beyond this. Will it be incremental for year after year, or will this be, I assume it will be. So that's a lot of talk about Vision Pro, but they were very contained demos. And obviously with prescription lenses too. So like, you can't use your glasses with it.
Right.
And but it felt fine to wear. Like, I know there's questions about comfort. It didn't feel like stunning. It didn't feel stunningly easy to wear, nor did it feel shockingly cumbersome. It felt like a VR headset. I think if you put it next to a Quest 3 or other headsets, it'll have a similar. You'll see the design similarities, but executed at a very finessed and nice level. So I think that, I don't mean to say it's a spatial computer for Apple, but but this is very much in the design world that I'm familiar with. So I think it's like a starting point that you go, okay, and then you want to see what else is going to happen.
There's some of the questions you raised. I think there might be some answers out there in public already, so I can try to point you to some of those. I think that in terms of, like you mentioned, the development process and how would somebody go about building a truly spatial experience versus initially mostly what they're showing, at least in the commercials and everything, is people bringing in their existing iPad OS and iOS apps. That's super easy, right? You just compile it for the right target and it runs. But it runs the way it would run on an iPad or a phone, which is 2D. And so that makes it the interface now changes because it changes from what you normally would have used multi-touch to something now that may be at a distance. Maybe you still have to multi-touch to match, but there are new interface paradigms to try to think about and adapt to. That's probably going to take some time before everybody understands the new input paradigms and understands how to get people to best use their hands and their eyes and their voice. So I think what they've provided is a really easy way for people who have existing things to pull them in. But in the developer demos that they showed at WWDC last year, they did explain how you move from that into a more spatial app already and showed examples of that, of how you might start your app that way, but you could have it come off the screen into the space very, very easily. And they even talked about how to have multiple personas. So clearly they're already hinting publicly at a very collaborative future where more than one person can be in the same space together. They often show you within a box, right? So the persona appears within a box, but there are videos on their site that you can find where you can actually step out and not be contained in that box. The box makes sense, I guess, for people who are used to Zoom and other chat, that it's just a better version of that, right? But they've also said in this last release of information, when they announced the final release date, they said that the personas, which is, other people call them avatars. I actually like the word persona better. Avatar is a cultural misappropriation from Hinduism, and I don't feel necessarily comfortable using that without everybody's blessing that's an okay word to use. So we do it anyway, but I like persona better. They've already said that the personas are compatible with Zoom and other third-party apps. So there will clearly be some way to have conversations with other people that is both within the boxes, but also breaking out of the boxes. And the potential for spatial computing overall, I won't say what Apple is going to do in the future, other than what they've already said, but I think the potential of this whole field is that this conversation we're having, or anything like it, will all feel like we're in the same place together. Not necessarily in a VR way either. I could see myself be in my office and you see yourself in your office, and two of us have teleported in to the space that the third person is already in, because we don't really need the offices except as backdrops. So it doesn't matter that we're merging these spaces somehow the way we're doing it in pie slices right here. I have a third of the screen, you have a third of the screen. But when we start doing this in spatial computing, we're going to all really feel like we're in the same place together, whether it's consistent place or not consistent. And what matters most, and I think this is what they're demonstrating, and hopefully you noticed, is the spatial audio has to be perfect. Like the subtleties of spatial audio, the people who work on audio will often recount, they'll often say, audio is at least half of the experience, but only ever 10% of the budget. And it's true in games, especially, that the audio is the thing people think of last, but it's the most important thing. Just think about the movie Star Wars without the music. Like, if it were just the actors talking, it would not have been as successful as it was. The music made it emotional. The music covered over any bad acting you might have had from various people, and just was an unseen character in the whole thing that brought it together. And for spatial audio, it's about the way we hear our own voices. That you will believe you're in a space when you hear the audio reflect that space back to you. So if I see myself in a cathedral, I need to hear my own voice. It's called side tone, technically. That I need to hear my own voice with the echoes and the reverb that you would have in that theater, and then I believe it. Then I believe I'm there. But if you don't do it, it's a very shallow experience. And it's the same is true for talking to other people. We want to hear your voice come from your mouth, not from the other side of the room, or not from inside our own heads, which is too often what happens. is that we internalize the audio. So the spatial audio, I'm sure will be great because there's awesome people working on it. You mentioned the visuals are top notch. I mean, yeah, that's super important. The people I know who worked on the project are really sticklers for making sure that the visual audio quality are absolutely top notch. Would never compromise on anything like that. I'm trying to think what else you mentioned that is already out in public.
Some of the gesture stuff
I think
and then
the gesture stuff. Yeah, I think they showed a lot of it. I don't think they. I won't say too much about other modalities, but they've showed the most important thing they've showed is what you said is the comfort. And sort of just to riff on that for a second, the reason the one button mouse worked, that was a lot of people's first computer mouse was a Macintosh one button mouse, right? And most of my PC mice have 2 buttons, 3 buttons. Why 1 button? And it's because you can't mess up. Like with a one button mouse, you can't accidentally delete things. You have to drag the icon into the trash can. And so when somebody who's not an expert at computers uses it for the first time, you are helping them to make sure nothing goes wrong, right? You're essentially providing them the easy way. And it may not be the power user preferred way, but you're providing them with a very, for lack of a better term, foolproof method of using a computer. And I think you're seeing the same things here. This is something that anybody could use. Anybody who has a hand can do the hand tracking. Anybody who has eyes can do the eye tracking. Almost anybody. There are a few actual. There are a few things that are really hard in eye tracking, like people who have a lazy eye. Often, it's a really hard problem to solve to figure out how to do eye tracking properly for people with some differences from the typical people. But companies do their best. They try to be as accommodating. And one of the most important aspects that they have said about this is the fact that if we need to accommodate accessibility in some way, if you can't use your eyes, there are fallbacks. If you can't use your voice, there are fallbacks. If you can't use your hand, there are fallbacks. So hopefully everybody's covered with at least 2 of the 3 things, or only 1 in some cases. But that it's incredibly important to folks that people aren't left behind, right? Anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, the accessibility thing is they're a company that's so well attentive to that is that gives me a lot of interest in seeing, and I know there are writers out there who focus on that, specifically. So that's something that I think the accessibility will be a really interesting part of this that they haven't gone fully into. And like you mentioned, the comfort, like it's so interesting. That ad, the most recent ad, which was that like the iconic, spin of that for Vision Pro, all these people wearing goggles and futuristic things. And then you see the grid of apps at the end. And I saw different comments on this, and I thought it was really cool. What hit me was that it was bypassing VR completely, and moving into the fantasies that we have of these magic goggles and magic things that do stuff. But there's also familiarity to that and a comfort in the fantasies that you've seen in films you recognize. And then the comfort at the end, which some people were like, oh, after all that, you're just going to show a grid of apps? How is that magical? But I thought the message was that here's the future. It feels like home. And I think that's what's so interesting is that there's a comfort, oh, I get this. I understand this. Not I'm going to be thrown into the deep end. And I think you're right. Like there's something now, the challenge of this is about to reach out to people, is to comfort them. And I think that there's something so interesting that also extends into, the computers as theater thing, or the game design theater. I'll go to Jeff Worth. Sorry to speak on your behalf, Jeff, but I remember when you spoke to me about immersive interactive theater, I spoke to him recently about these things where you do pop-ups and you sort of something experimental and artistic, and try to reach out to that, try to make an event where somebody could come up and talk to you. And he kind of shared anecdotally something I just stuck with me, that not everybody's ready for that. You may not want that imposed. You got to find moments of comfort. And he was pointing out in his work in interactive and immersive, there are these questions too. And then it makes me more admiring of people who work at Disney or Meow Wolf or any place or anything in new tech, that how do you make something that's new but also comforting and accessible? And so I think this is like you said, this is going to be the really interesting thing with Vision Pro, is that can it be more so and achieve that And you brought up the persona thing too, which is a great one. I've not had any demos involving that yet, but I think it's the most exciting part of it because it's kind of mind blowing if you think about like that it's not just you experiencing it, but it's everyone experiencing it together. And that's been one of the missing parts, I think, with what Meta's done. In that Meta certainly, and there are also companies who've been tackling this, like Spatial. Named Spatial, but I've met with them over the years where they've had these experiences trying to work on collaborative environments like this. Meta has had some element of it, but a lot of VR reporters talk about joining parties is really hard. Getting people together is sort of weirdly, cryptically annoying. The stuff that you do in Horizon Workrooms versus Worlds, it's not all intertwined. And it sounds like what Apple's going for is something that'll be more effortless, kind of like share play that they've been trying to do on the phones and other things. Well, they have been doing, not trying. But, something that you instantly invite, link in, and then boop, and then you're connected. And for all this time, that has not been happening in the space. So I think that is really exciting because if that gets cracked, then that is a small but giant, like you said, it's a missing piece in this that and brings in other people, which right now, even when I use VR right now, it's very app by app. And I think the ecosystem needs to be fluid. And even the Vision Pro running multiple things at once, I haven't really experienced that yet. But I think that's interesting. I forget that it's something that is not just, oh, you're going to launch this one thing. It can be overlapping in many things. And so I think that's what computers and phones are. So I think that's that's an interesting part of where spatial could evolve. HoloLens had that. But not many people got to experience that, but I remember the most interesting of HoloLens 2 was like, oh, you create this space over here, or Magic Leap, you create this little space over here and you can look around. And it was like a glimpse of where I feel like you could do more things like that in mixed reality headsets like these.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to that safety aspect. I think that is incredibly important. People need to feel safe in every way. If they feel unsafe in at least one way, that's going to really hold them back. And it does go to the ease of use. I mean, why did Zoom during the pandemic, why did everybody pick Zoom as the thing to do? There were other free video chat systems, right? And I don't think it was strictly about the video quality. It was the fact that you could just send somebody a link and it just worked. You clicked on the link and you were in. It worked too well because you had Zoom bombing. Anybody with the link could get in. Right. But it was just the easiest thing. And that's, I think, the reason that it won. And Apple, I think, learned that lesson because FaceTime was very proprietary. You can only FaceTime other people. Now you can send people a link to a FaceTime and it works in any browser. So, I think it's maybe a little late to compete with Zoom on that front, but maybe in the future. But that's the message is you just got to make it super easy and effortless and safe. The other thing about the mouse, the one button was the other thing. The other thing about all mice is true, is that it's the least effort input device we have. You just rest your arm on the table and just move your hand a little bit and you can make amazing things happen from a tiny little motion. And the gesture is like that too. HoloLens, I think, went astray because the field of view of the cameras was not in the right place. You had to hold your hand out here and do a bloom or do pinch, and it's I fenced in college. I could hold my arm for a really long time, even with a sword in it, with a weapon, but not long enough for Minority Report. Minority Report interface would never work in real life because people would get so tired, or they'd wind up with gorilla arm if they really did it for long. But just having your hand by your lap is going to be the easiest possible thing. And people, I think, will be super impressed with, and this is the thing Tim Cook was talking about, how it feels like it's reading your mind. It just works the way you think. And that's because of the gaze tracking. The gaze tracking is probably the single most important, for me anyway, who's been at this for a while, the single most important innovation. And not that things didn't have gaze before. They just weren't using it right. They were using gaze in a really crude way. But when it really works well, you don't notice it. It just seems to work. And it seems to know what you mean. It seems to know what you're intending to do. So the gesture is just the equivalent of the mouse button click. You don't have to point at anything. And I'll tell you this, if you... Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, just as a quick thing, the most mind reading thing like that happened in my demo was the zoom with eye tracking. You know, because
Right.
those moments where they said for you to zoom in on a photo, you just look wherever you want and then do that, and that did feel like you said, like mind reading, where I just had this, gee whiz. Even though I knew what was going on, I go, wow, any place I'm looking, it enhances. Like I'm not there's nothing to click, and so that's a fascinating synergy.
I wonder, I mean, how many times I've done this, I'm guilty of it. How many times have you gone to a physical photo and done this to zoom in?
Right.
And I wonder, are we going to start doing that in reality without our Vision Pro on, just like doing this all the time, trying to zoom into things?
You may forget you're not wearing the thing, and you'll try to do the same thing because it'll feel just as natural.
Right.
But it may not always work without the headset.
It's funny. But when something that a word you mentioned earlier in our conversation, Scott, was visceral, right? When you were talking about theater and just about these types of experiences, and as you were talking about the Vision Pro and this being a new experience and bringing in the comfort from all these things that we were just talking about, the natural user interface to making it familiar in some way. And I think a key to that is the personalization. And so that's why I thought I want to hear more about, the third time you went to try Vision Pro, you were able to see your photos rather than demo photos or somebody else's photos. And I want to know, was that visceral? Like, how did that feel to you, to seeing your family, your friends, the places that you visited in Vision Pro through spatial videos?
Yeah, it did have moments of viscerality. I was also there were some other people in the industry. A couple of us got demos, and I was comparing notes, and thinking about how people felt. Some people felt that they were, kind of moved to tears. I wasn't moved to tears doing it, but I do. I've had a lot of immersive things, so like
Yes.
it could happen. But I think that there's an intimacy. Yeah, like there was this very simple Thanksgiving video clip I took of my mom and my family, and Apple had guidelines and some suggestions with it, which is like maybe smaller, more intimate moments or nothing. And I began to sort of see what may have been meant by that, which was that these moments that were with direct eye contact and in these kind of close, medium, intimate range, the head size, the eye contact, there's something that begins to make you feel like you're there. My mom looks at me questioningly as I'm telling her that I'm shooting this video in 3D, and I just feel like I can read her there and I can see it, and I just feel like I'm kind of sitting at the table. Other times where I was like outside doing these more sweeping types of things, in a way kind of drew me out of that, because I felt that I was a little more in watching a video mode. And so surprisingly, I thought those would be very like immersive, and then I thought, well, it was okay, but it was more like I was watching a movie. But the moments that I was like sitting with people kind of put me in that, and also reminded me of the Project Starline demo that I was lucky enough to get with Google, where it was like, light field and life-size heads, and that eye contact has that feel. So there's something of that in it. I also really like looking at the photos, and in a way the photos do have a more visceral quality, because like I said, the one thing about the spatial videos is that you kind of are held back a bit. It's like you could see this, but about over here. And then the photos, you could just kind of keep going. And so you could blow that thing up to a big, nice, zoomed in view with really rich color and just kind of like throw yourself in it. And the panoramics were probably the most immersive of all, even more than spatial video in a way, because they're really cleverly done, almost like these. Reminds me of the when I went to Epcot as a kid, and those first moments of the surround, like video
Circle vision.
Circle vision, yeah. So like the feeling of like, oh, you're really in Alaska or these things, and so these panoramic photos have that feel because they're like looking through a window, the way they're framed, and so there's like a depth going on even though it's not 3D. And so you're looking around. It's like this window out into where you're going, where you were. And I feel like I would shoot a lot more panoramas to look at it in that mode. And I would want to see panoramic video like that. They haven't gotten into 360 video or anything like that. But So yeah, I think it does take on a different quality. And then it also made me think, like you said, not just intimacy with photos, but I'm really interested in this feeling of like, I mean, my God, you're logging in with your Apple ID. This is like going to greet you with like everything. Like, I'm so used to a VR headset really not being connected to anything that I'm doing. And then you go, well, maybe I'm using it as a monitor. Maybe I'm connecting to a few apps. Maybe I'm hooking it through one service. But this thing should be like, boop, okay, I'm using it like an iPad or anything else. Everything is there. And that immediately has intimacy in that you're like, oh, I've got my home stuff with me. And so I'm really curious how that feels, because it sounds like a pair of slippers. It sounds very comforting. You go like, oh, I put my slippers on, everything's here. Brought all my stuff in with me. And Apple has a lot of services. So I think that's where they're banking on that, because it's like, you got Apple Music, you got movies, or all these other things. Those all sound less exciting to start, but it's also huge because it's all the stuff that usually is hard to get into VR. Exactly. Oh, I'm working on something, but I need to get to my stuff. Well, my stuff is it's the metaverse thing again, of like, everyone talks about collaborating. How do you get to all your things? And Apple's like, well, we know where our things are. And you still have to hear about how everyone else is going to fold in, but if it's through apps, there's a common hook in. So yeah, that was a long answer to the intimacy question. But I think that there's intimacy in the comfort of that, because like,
Agreed.
When you restore from a backup and then your computer is like your computer, then it's like, okay, everything's here, I'm comforted. It's not just an alien device I picked up at a store. And I feel like starting it up, the Quest is a game console. It's more of the model of, you pick it up, new and exciting, I'm going to start getting some things to put on it. But Apple's taking the approach of like, well, you're going to get this, you're going to log in and all your stuff will be there.
Yeah, I mean, you called Apple a lifestyle company, right? Like, to your point there, right? Is that, my stuff is here, and yeah.
So it's interesting.
Just think about how awkward it is to have to use text messages, a very old technology, to go get your friend to jump into VR with you. You're like, why do I have to do that? Why can't I use all the things I would normally want to use within the experience? I shouldn't have to break the experience every time I want to actually communicate with somebody who isn't already there. So it's a super important thing to be fully integrated, so that, what happens when someone calls you and you're in the middle of doing something, or what happens when your child walks up to you and and says, "Daddy, I need your help on something." It's not good to be isolating people. Like, times we want to be isolated. But even entertainment, we want to share with other people, right? Entertainment normally is not an isolating activity. And even exercise, I think we'll find, is better together. That exercise is more fun when you're doing it with somebody else. And maybe they may not physically be in the same room with you, and they may not even be exercising at the same time as you. But the fact that you can bring other people into your routines is going to be super powerful as a social motivator to get people to exercise more. But just that act of your child walking up, and with what we would have called a VR headset, there's plenty of videos on YouTube of the parent clocking the child accidentally because the child got too close while they were trying to kill zombies. But with this device, you're going to see that the child shows up. If the child is talking to you, or your boss is talking to you, whoever is important is talking to you, you're going to see it, even if you were a bit immersed in whatever you were doing at the moment. And that's just an incredibly important quality for maintaining social connections and making sure that people feel like they're safe and they're in it together. And it's an easy, like slippers, an easy thing to slip in and slip on and off whenever you want to. I think those are great ways to describe what's going on there. So that's awesome.
Yeah, my son, something else pops into mind. My son who's 10, like I look at how people use stuff during the pandemic or even now, and he'll always be playing games, Roblox or whatever, and like he'll be doing it while FaceTiming with a friend, and they're not like chatting, so it's literally it's the kids are doing telepresence. They're just keeping it on in the background while they also play this, and sometimes they dip in and they do it, and then they don't. And then there are times where, like, I'm asking my son to come in and I'm telling him something, and then I hear this voice going, "Oh, does he have to go eat now?" And I'm like, "Oh, hey, you're on still. Cool. Hi." He's like the phantom family member as his friend. And like, he forgets about it, and it's I was like, oh my god, this is like the metaverse, like slowly materializing. Your phantom friends that are like connected still, but I think that's exactly it. It's very easy to do on an iPad or something else, a game console, and then it's like you need that for the headsets where you could be have someone floating around out there that you're connecting with, and you're doing some other stuff, and then maybe you're reconnecting with them, and then you're doing this, and you have different like we're already used to that and all the stuff we do now.
Yes.
And then it's like coming into that now. So I feel like that's like the folding into it in the headset form.
You mentioned the word metaverse a couple of times, and I think it's probably worth spending a minute on that. We're almost at the end, I think. But the interestingly, Apple didn't use the word metaverse at all. And they just, people wrote about, I think yesterday or the day before, their guidance to developers was to use spatial computing and not even use AR. Even though Tim Cook has used the word AR a lot, they want you to think about this as spatial computing and not as AR or VR. My sense is that's just because those terms are confusing to a lot of people, that if you use them for marketing, people don't know what to expect. They don't know what to get. Some people think AR is only on smartphones, and therefore this can't be AR, this has to be MR. Like, there's all these religious debates about what these words mean. So I think they're just like, I don't speak for them, but my guess is just like, look, we can explain spatial computing, people get it, let's just stick with that, so everybody knows what to expect. But the word metaverse didn't show up at all, and when asked specifically, they'll even say no. But I think there's an important distinction. And again, don't speak for the company, but an experience in which the three of us who trust each other, like now, come together, I would not call the metaverse. I would just call that telepresence. Co-presence is the scientific term for it. The metaverse to me is when you build the internet that connects everybody. So the strangers are also coming together. And that's when you start violating people's sense of safety, is when you have strangers coming together. Now you're out in public and people act in all sorts of ways, good and bad. And with a small group of people who know each other, there's a much lower chance of what you said before, bad actors, because there's a social accountability that happens when we know everybody who we're meeting with. If somebody's misbehaving, we're going to deal with it. But when we finally get to whatever the metaverse will be and whatever it'll be called by the time it runs around, it's going to be much more like going to the mall or going to any public place. And you're going to have to deal with all those things that go wrong. And you're going to need police, and you're going to need all sorts of other services. And so I think essentially Apple's just saying that's not where we're starting. We're starting with what's safe. And if people want to do that, like, Rec Room, sounds like Rec Room will be one of the apps that launched. I think they announced that. That can be something that people use to go let people meet who don't know each other. Because Rec Room has their own way of solving some of those social issues, right? They have their own custodial systems for having people behave, and a lot of kids use it as well. So it's important. But Apple is starting with what is known to be safe and good, and not taking the risk of doing something that for 30 years we've seen go wrong whenever anyone's tried it.
That's a great point. And it's also like probably starting from, first and foremost, Apple probably being a personal devices company, and Meta being a social media company. And then it's like, I've always thought of the metaverse, like you said, like it's kind of a evolution of social media, I guess, in the mind of, where it probably is destined to be, and why Meta's doing this. And they're going to be different. Yeah, you're right. They're going to be different discussions. There's a lot of nested discussions, and then Apple's usually set it up where they are building the platform and the hardware, and then enabling it, hopefully, for companies to figure out ways to develop this and come up with their own systems for it. But then sometimes the hook-ins are not there, and then there's all sorts of challenges there. But yeah, that's interesting. It's definitely, I'm not wild about the metaverse term either, but it's interesting. I think the problem now is terminology does start to get a little weird and wonky on all fronts. Also, like, even the front, I think about this a lot. VR. So we have VR and we have AR, and then there's mixed reality, and then there's a lot of big discussions on this. It's like, well, VR that uses mixed reality, is that AR? Is that moving towards something else? And I've seen all of the kind of spectrums on this, and you can even see in it, like, it's becoming an issue for how Meta handles it on the Quest. Mixed reality kind of only shows up really like here and there and optionally so far, and I'm hoping will pop up a lot more. It's not it's not front and center on the Quest 3. But then that's exactly it. Like Apple's making it front and center. But then they're doing the digital crown. But then how do you refer to those things? It will start getting messier, I would imagine, when you start wanting to specify controls. Does everybody have the digital crown reality in and out control? But maybe right now it's trying to reset the discussion. And VR, sometimes I always wonder if people just refer to VR down the road or whatever it'll be, because AR is so confusing. And Helen, your book is always something I refer to when I talk about this. But like when I read,
kind. Thank you.
Yeah, when I read Augmented Human, like it made me think a lot more about all the ways that your sensory system and augmenting yourself are not the domain of just a few things like visuals.
Mm-hmm.
And then I read like Ed Yong's Immense World last year, and I was kind of thinking about this because it's animal senses, and I got very interested in this idea of like you mentioned, Avi, about like audio, and I've really been interested in haptics, and like I just think all the ways you can be in a place or sense what other senses are happening when you're in a physical place. It's so complicated, and I don't even know what the right answer is. But the reason I'm saying that is that AR seems to incorporate something much more cognitive, mystical body than I think it seems to be. Like it's vaster, and so to use it as a term for a headset only seems like a very small subset. But I guess that's true for VR too. Anyway, this is where I think the terminology seems like it's in flux anyway. So I guess bring on spatial.
In 10 years, no one I think will use the terms AR, VR, MR at all. I think spatial computing will survive if people don't mess it up too much between now and then. I think the metaverse will probably be replaced by whatever is most successful. That'll just like in the same way Google and Xerox became the noun, or the verb even in some cases. We'll have a new one.
Yeah.
So it's just like cyberspace. Cyber became security, not virtual worlds, right? So it'll be there in some sense, but yeah, we don't know what that. And maybe spatial computing will take over. We'll see. It's already starting to get hyped up a little bit with people, the usual suspects writing books that are trying to take advantage of all the trends, and we'll see those out, I'm sure, soon. But it's important not to confuse people. I think you want people to know what they get, what to expect, and what they're paying for when they pay a significant amount of money. They should have a comfort in knowing what they're getting is not something ill-defined that nobody knows what it's good for. The value proposition has to be pretty clear. And it's just the beginning, as I think you said before too. It's still early days, and I would expect to see lots more stuff to happen over the next 10 years as the technology improves. I mean, you can pour as much money into this stuff as you want, and some things just take time. It's not a function of how much money you put in. Sometimes it's just like, hey, we just have to wait till chips get down to 2 nanometers and 1 nanometer and smaller, because the more efficient the chips are, the smaller the device, the less heat. All those things are just a function of time more than anything else. Like it just takes time. And for me, it's been 50 years in coming, so I'm well aware of how long this stuff takes. And so that's the message I think that most people should take away is that it's new. It's something to experiment with. It should be fun. We should be creative with it. It's the beginning of new media. Enjoy it. But let's not have the wars. We don't need the wars over terminology. We don't need the wars over who's better. Let's just take advantage of every great thing out there that we can start to use.
Completely, just make great things.
Yeah. That's where it is. All right. So we normally at the end of the interview ask one more question, which is, because you ask people a lot of questions, but how many people ask you questions? Think about what a question should be that we should ask you. What is a question that we didn't ask you, but something that you would really love to be asked about, and we'll in the process we'll ask you, and hopefully you'll answer. That's perfect.
Yeah, ask me about magic. Yeah, I think I don't know what specifically, but like where does my interest in magic
I've got a good question about magic. So we talked a little bit about safety, and one of the issues in magic is it's all about tricking people in some sense, right? It's all about distracting people's attention. You may know a lot more about magic than I do. I'm a fan of magic, but I'm not a practitioner. But when somebody comes up on stage and you say, let's say, fool them or steal their watch, it's all for fun. It's all for the sake of entertaining people and in some ways laughing at our own limitations about how dumb we can be in terms of perception. The magician is a master, expert at manipulating our senses and our attention. But in some sense, we've seen where technology can go wrong when the same tricks that can be used to entertain us can be used to deceive us. In the case of, let's say, highly targeted advertising or manipulations of that sort. So I'm wondering if you can maybe draw a connection between all the things that we know from the entertainment side of magic as now applied to technology. Where can it go wrong and how can it be abused as well?
That's a good and big question. I think I've been into magic for a number of years since I was a little kid. And I would come and go and do the tricks and collect a lot of books on it, especially now. I think at one point my colleagues at CNET realized I could do magic tricks. I never brought it up to them, and then I would do a few things and perform it at CES, and they would just go, "Oh, you do these things," and I was like, "I'm capable, but not great." And but I like books on magic theory, and recently there was a great overlap in that Curtis Hickman, who did The Void. Yeah. As a magician, had this great book called Hyperreality, which is basically a magic book about VR, and it's kind of my worlds colliding, and so this gets into the answer that comes to mind when I think about this. It sounds like a sidetrack, but I'm going to get back to it. Is I also think about I was reading another book by Abraham Burks, and I've been reading a lot of experiential type things, Experience Design Manifesto last year, which was like I was interested in. It got me thinking about the framing and the invitation to an experience. And the reason I say that is because I think a lot of theater things, trust of this, the trust fall of improv, the trust fall of an experience, the magician's game, you're entering kind of a contract. You're kind of entering this thing where you ideally are agreeing to let yourself go on this journey, to let go. You maybe a magician might say that you want to be fooled, you want to believe. And it's not fun to be tricked when you don't know you're being tricked. Right. That's a scam. That's a street scam. That's where magicians, and that's like the Amazing Randy, and like people would try to debunk people using things in the real world that were manipulative, like seances and things like that. So I think that's a really interesting framing thing here, where it's like the magic of art, the magic of these journeys is that you want to go on them willingly. And I think early tech is interesting because I've thought about this too. Enterprise headsets and things, or even like early access stuff. You're kind of signing yourself up for the Black Mirror adventure. You're like, I'm entering into a subset. Enterprise can do the eye tracking, consumer is harder. I think that and we have like EULAs and other things, but like, I think that there's endless care that needs to happen in that world when you start dealing with it, going from the magic, the fun, the Disney trip, to the everyday functional. And that's what I think about like Facebook and like, all the things you go, wait, what did I authorize? What is it using? What are the data things? And you have like endless questions when you deal with more senses, eye tracking or whatever else, or, there's endless possibilities for like where algorithms could be employed to potentially derive more information about yourself. And so I think like the care with that, not just social networks and strangers and everything like that, but just like how these things will become more perceptual, interconnected. And I think it's being able to understand when you're entering that contract, like what you're, what is that, and how do you learn that? And maybe it does need to be starting with baby steps, because even now with VR, people, I have parents who get headsets and they don't even know about anything with the settings or anything, and they're not designed for kids, but people still use them for kids. And I think that can be applied now to the current internet and also certainly to the worlds to come. So I think what's interesting to me about magic is the cognitive, the errors that we make and the leaps we make, the assumptions, the way we world build is so fascinating to me. and helps explain how I perceive the world. But when I think about it being done to bad effect or bad actions, it's very unsettling. And so there is not much of a good answer there. I don't think there's much of a good answer. I think we're in the mess that we are right now, but we're hurtling towards a lot of it, I feel, with new technologies. But maybe it starts with community that you work with best. Like, it almost feels like like you mentioned, it starts with small, trusted, like, it almost feels like the world we're in now is like getting to the point where social networks or people are falling out of them and going, I don't like this, in a game more peer-to-peer. And like, maybe there needs to be something where you kind of rebuild some of these structures. Because if you dump it all into these things and just go, oh, I'm going to throw more stuff in there, then it does feel like, I don't know, just instinctually just feels way out of control.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said. I think that what I pulled out of there is a sense of, in order for great things to happen, we need a certain amount of vulnerability. Like, we're going to be exploiting cognitive gaps that we have in order to make magic work, right? If I could perceive everything you did as a magician, it wouldn't be fun because I'd see it all. Mm-hmm. So we're exploiting those cognitive gaps that we all have in order to be surprised and entertained, but in a way that's consensual, in a way where I kind of knew what I was signing up for, even if I didn't see the sleight of hand. I knew something was coming, and I am pleasantly surprised at the end of the day. In fact, it would be less fun if I actually saw exactly what you did, right? So that's important, but people right now are pushing back on companies that are exploiting them and using psychological tricks as well to do so, because they don't consent. Even though they clicked that EULA and said okay to the site, they didn't read it. They didn't really know what was coming, and they didn't really consent. And so it's not safe in the same sense that being with somebody you trust, who's gonna catch you when you fall, that's so important to the success of everything in the field that we can't skip that. That's a critical step.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
On the other side of that, when we do talk about magic, and yes, it's important to talk about like all these things about safety, but on the other side of magic, and for me, like with AR and why I got into this medium was the pure wonderment of it. When I saw the demo for the first time, it was magical. The 2005 webcam on a desktop computer, and we had 6 black and white square AR fiducials, right? And the webcam magically on the desktop computer conjured one blue 3D cube, and behold, that's what it was. It was the cube, right? And this thing was pure magic, because there was always like, wait, how is that thing there? That's not really in my physical space, but it's there. And it was a pure magic trick. And that's why I fell in love with it. And I was also really early on inspired by magic and magicians like Georges Méliès, who was a filmmaker, right? And he was a magician first. And so he really kind of took the tricks of the stage, right, and brought them to cinema. So I think there's this very lovely history of magic in technology and in theater and all of these kind of performances, and perhaps even early kind of analog immersive experiences. So I think there's something really delightful there to consider for sure.
Yeah, and the what got me going all the way back to what got me writing about tech in theater in the first place was this whole time period, definitely around like reading Howard Rheingold's The Virtual Community when I was working on the Utopia Parkway. It's like carrying me way back. And I was thinking about the like new states of mind in new experiences. And like I was a psychology major at the time doing creative writing, and I was like kind of thinking about like starting to kind of kick around the ideas of like ways that we change through technology, or the ways we're adapting. And like I think it's exciting to me in that there's opportunities to understand new parts of yourself and to sort of evolve. It can be scary too, because then you might say, oh, we're glued to our phones, or we're doing other things, or we're getting into behaviors. But there's ancient parts of the way we function, and then there are new parts of tech, and these interface in such unusual ways socially that like there's a lot of magic there all the time. And I think that's something that it's the social magic of that I think is like the most hypnotic to me, and I think makes me most interested. That's theater, all the
Nice.
time.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, all the way. It's the evolution of sitting around the campfire and telling each other stories, all the way up through theater, and then adding more and more technology into it. It gets more and more complicated, but the core of it is still that same core of humans sitting together and telling each other stories and connecting through those stories.
Yeah, you bet. It's all about connectedness. I remember after you read my book, you sent me such a nice note, Scott, and you talked about how you're like, AR is about connectedness, right? It's about connection. And that's a point that I always try to bring across in my keynotes and the types of experiences that I highlight, from accessibility to some of the things that we talked about today. So it's just been a pleasure having you today, and you sharing all your rich background and your ideas. And Avi and I were saying, we really appreciate how you write. It's very human, and so it's been a joy to have you on and learn more about you and the way you see the world in such a wonderful, unique way. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, same
Thank you.
for
This
me.
has been great, and I'm excited about continuing to work in these spaces to come. So it's fun. It's been an interesting adventure. It's been great. It's been a decade's adventure, it feels like, even though it's just been now. But I think, it's continually evolving. Yeah.
Hey, this week has been a decade, right? With everything coming out of CES and all the announcements.
It's been exhausting. I'm not even in Vegas, which I'm kind of. It was like I'm on blood thinners right now, so it's like that's a whole thing. I was like, but Vegas and blood thinners don't seem like they would mix well. But yeah, then it's like Vision Pro, and then like all these announcements, and like I remember at the end of Monday, I was like, that cannot have just been one day,
right?
just curled up after that. Yeah, so I'm trying to get some breathing room.
We're just getting started. So thank you
We
again.
are.
We appreciate your time and you joining us.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.